3 Apache girls laughed at white man until their tribe leader made them marry him. The morning was the color of cold tin. Frost spread over the grass in thin veins, catching the first light as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jacob Hart rode slow along the fence line, one glove loose, the reins resting in his palm. His ribs still carried the ache of winter work, and the cabin behind him had nothing worth hurrying back to. Only a half-burned candle, an iron pot, and silence that pressed close. The land stretched out in every direction, stripped of motion. Even the wind had nothing to say. The sound of his horse's hooves came small and far between, the rhythm swallowed by the emptiness. That was when he saw them. Footprints. Not cattle, not boots. 3 sets, light and close together, crossing the frost toward the old line shack. One print showed a tear at the heel, leaving a bare crescent of skin. Another dragged, scuffed like someone limping. All came from the east, from the dark cut of the mesa. Jacob slid off the saddle, crouched, and traced the indent with his gloved fingers. Fresh. No return tracks. His horse shifted, leather creaking, but he didn't look back. Something in the stillness pulled him forward. The shack sat crooked, shoulders slumped, door hanging by one hinge he'd mended last fall. No smoke, no sign of use. A magpie perched above the frame, watching him with a pale, coin-bright eye. He pushed the door with care. It rasped open. 3 young women sat pressed into the far corner, knees pulled tight, shoulders touching. Apache braids ran dark against their shawls. Their faces held dust and cold, their eyes a stillness deeper than the morning air. They didn't flinch. They didn't speak. They looked at him as though measuring a storm. The tallest had a strip of red cloth knotted around her wrist. The smallest clutched an empty tin cup, the one Jacob had left here weeks ago. The one in the middle watched his hands, not his face. Jacob raised both palms, slow, empty. Breath hung between them like smoke. The ribbon on the tall girl's wrist shifted in a thread of wind. The scrape on her cheekbone caught the light. He took one step back. The floor whispered under his boots. Outside, his horse shook its head, the bridle ringing like a thin bell. No one spoke. The frost held. And Jacob knew, without knowing why, that his morning had just been claimed by something he could not walk away from. Jacob stayed in the doorway longer than sense allowed. The cold bit at his ears, but it was not the cold that held him. It was the way their eyes did not plead and did not welcome, just waited, as if they knew the world well enough to trust nothing. The smallest girl shifted her weight, a quiet, stiff movement like she was keeping the ache in her legs from showing. He noticed how her bare toes curled against the dirt floor, white at the knuckles. The middle one sat straighter when she saw him watching, a defiance sharp as flint. The tall one, ribbon still around her wrist, let her gaze pass over him and settle back on the wall. They were not afraid in the way he'd seen fear before. This was a different kind, a careful, measured kind, like people who had learned that fear must be hidden or it would be used against them. Jacob's ribs gave a throb that had nothing to do with winter. A memory cut through, thin and sudden, of a boy on a church step, hands frozen to the shape of a prayer, watching wagons leave him behind. No one had said a word to that boy, not even him. He'd kept walking, and he'd carried that silence for 20 years. Now the same silence breathed in this room. He stepped inside, closing the door against the wind. The air was stale, touched with old ash from the stove. He looked at the table, one chipped plate, the hard bread, a knife with the tip broken off. His own work, from before he'd stopped caring if the shack stayed standing. "Anyone hurt?" The words came low, unsure. They gave him nothing back. He thought of turning. The smart thing would be to ride away, tell someone else, someone who spoke their language, someone who wouldn't be taken for the wrong kind of man if found here. In this country, a white man alone with Apache girls was a story others would write in blood before truth. And yet, the thought of leaving them was heavier than the thought of being hunted for them. The ribbon on the tall girl's wrist had a frayed edge, as though it had been torn from something larger, maybe clothing, maybe a blanket. He wondered if it was the only piece of softness she had left. He wondered who had tied it for her. The smallest girl's cup clinked softly against her knee. Empty. He felt the sound in his teeth. He set his gloves on the table and crouched so his eyes were level with theirs. "I've got water at the horse. Bread in the cabin. Still Still nothing. But none of them looked away now. He stayed crouched until his knees burned. It was not the first time life had given him a choice between the clean road and the right one. The clean road had always left him dirtier inside. Jacob stood, took the water pail from where he'd set it, and held it out. Not to one, but to all. An offer without demand. The middle one moved first, slow as if testing the air between them. Her fingers brushed the rim, then closed around the handle. Jacob let go. The decision was made. He would not walk away this time. Whatever came for them would have to come through him first. By mid-morning, the frost had broken into wet patches under the sun, but the chill still clung to the air. Jacob had brought them to the cabin, one slow trip at a time. First the water, then the bread, then a blanket from the chest. They followed without speaking, moving like shadows that weren't sure they belonged to him. It was while he was splitting wood that he saw the dust. A thin column, far off along the eastern rise, curling up in the still air. Not wind, not cattle, riders. He felt it in his chest before he could name it. He knew the land well enough to know there were no friendly errands headed this way. Inside, the middle girl stood at the window, watching the same rise. She didn't speak, but her shoulders drew tighter, her jaw set like stone. The tall one's ribbon hung loose now, the knot slipping as if her wrist had been twisting against it. The smallest girl sat near the stove, clutching the tin cup as if it were a weapon. Jacob stepped in, closing the door behind him. "You know them?" he asked quietly. A glance passed between the three. Finally, the tall one nodded. Once. Sharp. Her voice, when it came, was low and in accented English. "Tribe leader. His sons." Jacob stilled. "He's looking for you." Another nod. Then the middle one spoke for the first time, each word measured like it cost her something. "We refused. Laughed." She looked down. "He chose to make us pay." The smallest girl whispered something Jacob didn't catch, but the tone was enough. He'd seen that tone in the eyes of calves driven to slaughter. The tall one's ribbon, it was no keepsake. It was a mark, a claim. He leaned on the table, weighing the words he didn't have time for. Apache politics were not his to navigate, but this was simpler than politics. It was pursuit. It was punishment. Outside, the dust column had grown. 5 riders now, maybe 6, dark against the pale land. Still a mile out, but closing. "Do they know this place?" he asked. The middle girl's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to him. "Yes," he cursed under his breath. He had 1 rifle, a half box of shells, and a cabin door that wouldn't stop a hard kick. The smart thing would be to leave now, cut across the wash to the old mining road, lose them in the canyons. But the girls moved slowly, one limping, all underfed. They wouldn't make distance fast enough. He thought of his own past. The boy on the church steps, the one left behind because helping him was too hard, too dangerous. That boy's ghost was in the room now, looking at him through 3 different sets of eyes. The riders crested a low hill, their horses dark and lean, their shapes clear against the bright sky. No more than minutes now. Jacob stepped to the shelf, took down the rifle, and checked the chamber. The click was sharp in the close air. All 3 girls turned toward the sound. "They'll be here soon," he said, voice even. "When they come, you stay low. You stay quiet." He didn't add the rest, that there might be no safe way out, that he wasn't sure which would be worse, being caught alive or not at all. The dust kept rising. The ground felt smaller, and Jacob knew that whatever this was, it had already gone too far to turn back. The riders were still far enough for the horizon to swallow them, but Jacob knew they'd circle back if they didn't find the girls here. Time had stretched into something fragile. He decided to use what little was left. In the narrow yard behind the cabin, he set the rifle down on the chopping block. The middle girl watched from the doorway, arms crossed. Her eyes kept sliding to the weapon, then to him. He gestured toward it once, then stepped back. An invitation, not an order. She hesitated, then came forward. Her hands were small but steady as she picked up the rifle. Jacob showed her the weight, the balance, silent demonstrations, his own hands only brushing hers when absolutely necessary. She mimicked the stance he'd taken, leaning into the stock. The first pull of the trigger clicked on an empty chamber. He nodded approval. No flinch. The smallest girl appeared next, still clutching her cup. He handed her a split piece of kindling instead of the rifle, showing her how to stack wood for a fast flame. She crouched beside the stove inside, arranging each piece with careful precision, as if the pattern itself mattered. The tall one worked without asking, fetching water from the pail, filling the dented kettle. None of it was talk. It was work. It was trust, measured in inches. When the kettle began to hiss, Jacob rolled up his sleeve. A pale scar crossed his forearm, jagged as lightning. He caught the middle girl's glance and gave a small shrug, the kind that says, "This happened. I'm still here." She said nothing, but after a moment she lifted the hem of her sleeve just enough to show a mark along her wrist. A rope burn, old but deep. He didn't touch it. Didn't need to. The day thinned toward afternoon. They ate together at the table, each pulling small bites from the hard bread softened in hot water. The sound of chewing and the occasional clink of tin filled the room. Jacob found himself counting the moments between those sounds, memorizing them. Quiet had never felt like this before. Not heavy, but whole. After the meal, he took them outside again. The light was lower now, warm against the frost-dark soil. The smallest girl laughed once, not loud, just a breath with shape, when the tall one missed the bucket with a paw and splashed her boots. It startled him, that sound. It had no fear in it. As shadows lengthened, he showed them how to latch the shutters from inside, how to slide the heavy trunk against the door. The tall one tested the trunk's weight. He could see the strength in her arms. The middle one checked the rifle again without prompting. The smallest girl set her empty cup on the windowsill, as if it belonged there now. For a brief moment, standing in the doorway with the cold evening air pressing against the warmth inside, Jacob let himself believe they might hold through the night. The riders were out there, but so was the silence between them now, solid, almost like peace. It was the kind of peace a man learns not to trust. But still, he wanted to. The sun had dropped behind the mesas when the sound came. Hoofbeats, steady and deliberate, carrying the weight of men who weren't afraid of what they might find. Jacob was already at the window, rifle in hand, eyes tracking the movement down the wash. 6 riders, just as he'd counted earlier. The lead man wore a long rawhide coat, the fringe swinging with each step of his horse. Behind him, 2 younger men sat tall in their saddles, rifles resting casual across their thighs. The girls had gone still. The smallest reached for her cup, clutching it so tightly Jacob thought it might crack. The middle one's jaw had set again, the hard mask sliding back over her face. The tall one stood with her shoulders squared, the ribbon loose at her wrist. The riders stopped 20 paces from the cabin. The man in the rawhide coat called out in Apache first, words Jacob didn't understand but recognized in tone. Command, not request. Then, in broken English, "Send them out. They belong to me." Jacob stepped into the doorway, rifle leveled, but not yet aimed. "They're not going anywhere." The lead man's smile was small, sharp. "White man should not bleed for what is not his." "They're not yours either," Jacob said. "Not anymore." The man's eyes cooled. He nodded to one of the younger riders who dismounted, hand on the butt of his revolver. Jacob took one step forward, planting himself between the door and the oncoming shadow. His heart was steady in a way he hadn't felt in years. The younger man stopped short of the porch. "Move," he said flatly. Jacob shook his head. "Not today." The standoff stretched. The horses stamped. The sky deepened toward night. Then came the twist. Quiet, but sharp. The tall girl stepped forward, past Jacob, until she stood beside him in the doorway. Her voice was steady when she spoke in Apache, but her eyes were on Jacob. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the way the men on horseback reacted, shifting, muttering, looking to their leader. Whatever she'd said, it had changed the shape of this meeting. The lead man dismounted, slow, deliberate. He came closer, stopping just at the edge of reach. "She says," he told Jacob, "you took her as wife, that you took all 3. His gaze was cold. "That makes you tribe business now." It was a lie. Jacob knew it, and so did she. But it was also a shield. In their law, a husband had rights, even against a leader. That shield might be thin, but it was better than none. Jacob didn't look at her. He kept the rifle steady. "Then you know where I stand." The air between them was tight as wire. Finally the leader spat in the dirt, turned, and swung into his saddle. "For now," he said. Then to his men, A short command, and they pulled back, hooves thudding into the dark. Jacob stayed in the doorway until the last hoofbeat faded. Only then did he lower the rifle. His knees felt loose. He turned to the tall girl, but she was already moving back inside, the ribbon on her wrist catching the faint light like a flare in the dark. She had just risked everything too. Night settled fast after they left. The cabin walls seemed to hold their hoofbeats long after the sound had gone. Jacob leaned the rifle against the table, fingers still curled tight from holding it. His shoulders ached, but it wasn't from the weight of the gun. The girls moved quietly, as if the air itself might shatter. The smallest finally set her cup down on the windowsill, its faint clink loud in the stillness. The middle one closed the shutters, fastening the latch with deliberate care. The tall one sat near the stove, her ribbon trailing over her knee, eyes fixed on nothing. Jacob knew they weren't safe. Men who turn away once can turn back. But for tonight, the line had held. He stepped outside into the cold. The moon was a thin edge, cutting light over the frost. From here he could see the wash, the tracks already fading where the wind had passed. He thought of the leader's face, the way his jaw had tightened at her words. That lie she told had been more than protection. It had been a choice to tie her fate to his. He wasn't sure why that unsettled him more than the threat of bullets. When he went back in, the kettle still steamed on the stove. He poured water into the tin cups, 3 now, found in a box beneath the bed. He set one in front of each of them, his own last. No one drank right away. They sat, hands around the cups, letting the heat seep in. The middle girl met his eyes for a moment. Just a moment, but it was enough. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She simply looked at him like a man she might one day trust. They bedded down in shifts, Jacob taking the first watch at the window. The night outside was open and wide, but his gaze kept circling back to the dim light from the stove, the quiet shapes resting on the floor. Every so often one of them would stir, a shadow shifting under the blankets. Each time, he felt the same thing, a strange, steady pulse in his chest, equal parts fear and something he couldn't name. Hours passed. The horizon paled. Just before dawn, he heard them again. Distant hoofbeats, fading east. Whoever had led them here was gone. This time, it sounded like leaving. When the sun came, the frost was thin and wet. The girls rose one by one, gathering the small things they had. Ribbons, cups, a folded scrap of cloth. Jacob saddled his horse, then took the mare from the pen and led her to them. She was strong enough to carry all 3 if they took turns. No words. Just movement. The smallest climbed up first, the other 2 walking beside. They started south, toward the edge of the land where the river cut through the hills. He walked with them, his rifle slung across his back. Behind them, the cabin stood small against the empty land, smoke trailing from its chimney in a thin line. Ahead, the ground opened into the kind of distance that could hide 100 lives. Jacob didn't look back. Neither did they. The sound of their steps and the slow rhythm of the horses' hooves were all the morning needed. By the time the cottonwoods along the river showed their first spring buds, Jacob had almost forgotten the sound of hoofbeats behind him. Almost. The land had a way of keeping memories under the surface, like water that looked still until you saw the slow pull of the current. They'd built a lean-to first, then a small shelter from river stone and scavenged timber. The girls worked with the same silence they had carried from the shack, though it had shifted in weight. It was no longer the silence of waiting for something bad. It was the silence of making something hold. The smallest began to walk without the limp. The middle one learned to check the traps Jacob set, her hands quick and sure. The tall one's ribbon frayed until it was only a strip of thread, but she kept it tied, even when it could no longer circle her wrist twice. They spoke more now. Not much. Words were still measured, chosen, but enough for Jacob to learn their names, and for them to learn his without saying it aloud. Names were not the same as trust, but they were the shape of it. One afternoon, he found the smallest girl washing the tin cup in the river, letting the current carry away the grit. She set it on a rock to dry, not in the cabin as she always had. A small thing, but he understood. It wasn't the cup that mattered anymore. It was knowing she could put it down. The threat never came back. Maybe the leader decided the cost was too high, or maybe he found new ways to fill his pride. Jacob didn't waste breath wondering. Survival had a way of taking up all the room a man had. Seasons turned. The river swelled and thinned. The cottonwoods leafed and emptied. The shelter grew into a home, One door, 3 bunks, a stove that burned steady through winter. The girls, no, the women now, moved through it as if they'd always belonged there. Jacob sometimes thought of the boy on the church steps. In some ways, he was still there, watching people pass. But in other ways, he had finally stood up and walked away. On a late autumn evening, they shared a meal in near darkness, the only light the slow flicker from the stove. The ribbon's last thread broke that night. The tall one didn't tie it back. She let it fall to the table between them. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow, and the land was quiet again. Quiet in a way that promised it would keep them this time.